And now I want to acknowledge the various Aboriginal lands in which we are gathered tonight. I'm on lands of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, tonight we're going to be hearing from Keiko, Dr. Keiko Yasukawa and Janet Dyne, both of whom probably don't need any introduction to most of you, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. Keiko, as our fearless leader, has been a long-term contributor to our field over many years, both in her role as lecturer at UTS and as president of New South Wales Adult Literacy Council and vice president of ACAL. Janet's also been a contributor to the field over many, many years in a range of contexts and roles, and at present she's teaching at Ultimo TAFE. So, excuse me, after we hear from Keiko and Janet, we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So if you've got questions that you want to pose during the presentation, then put them up in the chat box, and we'll get around to that at the end. All right, so I won't take up any more time. Keiko, over you first. Over to you.
You can see the slides, everyone. And I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're joining this meeting. And I'm on the land of the Camaragal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So thank you everyone for joining this workshop. The workshop is in response to some comments that were made in our December conference last year, when many of us were teaching online, and there were discussions about the difficulties of engaging adult learners in the online mode. And so Janet and I are just going to share one strategy that we've both used in our different contexts with you, and to hopefully get your thoughts and feedback on this strategy, which we call artifactual critical literacies. And it's a strategy that I think will work not just in online teaching. It can certainly work very well in the classroom setting, face-to-face as well. So a lot of us experienced the difficulties of engaging learners online, learners joining an online class, but who won't switch their cameras on, so we can't see them, and we can't really know if they're engaged or not. The difficulties in eliciting responses from individual students online, difficulties of implementing and monitoring pair and small group work, putting them into breakout sessions and so forth. It requires a certain amount of digital literacy, not just on the part of the teacher, but also on the part of the students as well. And also the difficulty in having sort of discrete one-on-one chats with learners individually, because either everyone's on the screen at the same time or nobody's on screen, and you have to set up a separate meeting. Whereas in the classroom, as I'm sure all of you know, we can just subtly sit next to a learner who looks a bit lost or disengaged and have a quiet chat with them. That's much more difficult online. And also there are limitations in the range of resources we can use for teaching and learning. I certainly experienced this very strongly in teaching numeracy, because everything is just two-dimensional. But rather than just thinking about online solutions, I think it helps to kind of go back to some first principles about teaching, that, you know, regardless of whether we're teaching online or face-to-face, we have to know our learners, who they are, their interests, their needs, their goals. And the best way to engage learners is to use what matters to them and to devise learning activities to engage and involve the learners around those things that mean something to them. And also starting from what they know, what's familiar to them, and what they find personally meaningful. And avoiding cognitive overload that could lead easily to disengagement. And using topics or themes where the learners can and will want to exercise some ownership for. So these are some, I think, important first principles to always keep at the forefront of our thinking when we're designing lessons and activities. So artifactual literacies is an idea that some English literacy scholars, Pahl and Jennifer Rowsell, I think she might be Canadian, but has worked with Pahl. And so they've talked about artifactual literacies and that every object tells a story. And they said that in our work, we found that eliciting stories about objects from students opens up their home experience and enables teachers to access communities that may not be visible within schools or colleges. And as we all know, some communities are less powerful than others, particularly, but not only, migrant communities who have the challenge of finding a place within a new context. Neighborhoods and communities hold valuable stories that are often instantiated within objects. So if the material world of objects is accessed in literacy learning, more experiences can flood in from outside to make sense of students' worlds as they compose and write. So this is a quote from Pahl and Rowsell, and we thought it might be useful at this point to make this a little bit more concrete with our stories, Janet's and my stories, about using artifactual literacies in our own classrooms. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Janet. Thanks, Janet. Janet, you're muted.
There you go. I'm also speaking to you from Gadigal lands and pay my respects to the peoples of the Eora Nation. I wanted to talk to you. I did speak to you about it a little bit at the conference, how I was teaching an online individual pathways literacy class, which met twice a week. It was very difficult to do individual programs online. And we did a little bit of going into rooms, but the students actually quite liked meeting together. They quite liked the interaction, seeing each other as a group. And we often looked at articles about COVID and about vaccination and about things that were very relevant and that they wanted to know and explore. But anyway, the first meeting, I was thinking of an icebreaker. The students I knew were reluctant even to speak in class, and some students, and they were all the more reluctant to speak online in what we had already experienced. And some of them expressed an interest in being able to speak online and being able to speak to a larger group of people and to feel more comfortable and at home with that. So, and what we had experienced the previous session was people really being very quiet and not contributing much. So through a kind of a bit of shyness and a bit of unfamiliarity with what was, with the medium. So at the first meeting, as an icebreaker, I researched a little bit about icebreakers and I found one I liked. And I asked the students to go and find an object in their house, something that they particularly liked, something that they really liked and that they would be able to share with us. They would be interested to share with us. It could be anything, I said. It could be anything at all. Just to come and show it to us and tell us, what it is that you like about this or what it means to you or, why you've chosen this particular object from your house. And the students went away. But first of all, I started the ball rolling with one of my favourite objects. And it's a very useful object from my kitchen. And it's a tiny grater. And it's got a story. So first of all, I could show the next slide, Keiko, of my tiny grater. Yep. So that's it. Now you can't tell how tiny it is, but I will show you in a minute. This grater has a story in that it was part of a desert sushi kit that a friend had given to me and made for me in a shoebox. Estelle and I were talking about the usefulness of shoeboxes. And this was a shoebox that contained, it contained seaweed, the dried seaweed, and a roller. It contained ginger, a little tin of ginger, and it contained the rice and the vinegar that you need for sushi. And it was a wonderful thing. And I took it where I was working in Yakanara. That's where I was going. People gave me things to take to the desert, to the Great Sandy Desert, where I was working in a remote community up there. And when I had guests, I was able to bring out my sushi kit containing this little grater as well. This little sushi kit, and this was part of it. And I was able to entertain guests there on the edge of the Great Sandy Desert with my sushi and with this. And the thoughtfulness of my friend who had created this box and the beauty of the design of it, I was very happy about receiving it and using it. So next slide, Keiko, thank you. That can show you how cute it is. Really very cute. I still use it every week to grate ginger. It could do nutmeg, but I really love this little thing. So I showed them that, and then I brought another object because I thought I'd demonstrate something that was more beautiful and in a different way. We can show the next one. I brought a little ceramic donkey and from my china cabinet, and I brought that and showed that to the students. And this was a little ceramic donkey. You might recognize that pattern as being from Central Europe, from Czech or Slovak republics. And my husband brought it back as a present one time from Slovakia, knowing that I have a particular love of donkeys. So there he is. So I demonstrated those, I brought those, and I told their stories, shared the stories about them. And the students invited them to ask me questions, which they did. And we had a very nice chat about those things. And next slide. And then I asked the students to go off and identify their item and bring it back. And the students went off, and it took them not very long, less than 10 minutes, to go and find their own items. I think I gave them 15 minutes, but they were ready back with their items. So yeah, and the way that the students presented their item and showed it and spoke about it was truly, it was quite amazing. It was so different from other attempts to speak online, or to, even I had been with some of these students giving class presentations before we were locked down, but the way that people spoke about this item that they treasured or that they had a story about was it brought their presentation to another level, because it meant to them, they were confident and in presenting, and it was from the heart, what they were saying. And I was very impressed by this. So there's each one, for example, someone brought a coral that they have sitting on their mantelpiece, one of those the sort of corals that have got those ridges in them. I forget the name of that coral, but it was so beautiful. And she told about her experience of going to the Barrier Reef with her husband, and that they found this, and it was her object. There were clocks, there were different things that people brought. So we did this all orally, all as an oral presentation. And it was so good, it was such a buzz, that on reflection, I thought later that it would have been a great opportunity to produce written texts. We could have produced texts about these items and written their stories. It would have been a great stimulus for writing about these objects. Yes. So next one. I think that's you, Keiko.
Yes, I think it is. So thank you, Janet. So my story is in my context as a lecturer at UTS, and artifactual literacies is a topic in the subject that I teach called multi-literacies and multimodalities. It's a subject that my colleague Ros Appleby developed and taught before she retired 2 years ago. And when I taught the subject in 2021, I had about 20 students. And of course, we were all teaching and studying via Zoom. And I had been using breakout rooms to encourage small group discussions each week. And, I did all sorts of things to try to encourage discussions, some of which worked. So for example, I had quite a few Mandarin speaking students, so I put them all in the same group so they could, talk about the ideas in Mandarin rather than stay silent because they couldn't find the right English words quickly enough. But then, there were some other students who, for a whole range of reasons, didn't contribute very much to discussions, even in small groups. And they'd have their cameras off, and it was, difficult and also frustrating to some of the other students who wanted to have vibrant discussions. So I thought, okay, well, why don't we try this artifactual literacies and see if that will get things moving, get students talking. So first of all, I modeled the task with my own example. And so I had a photo of this glass rabbit. It's a rabbit that was a gift to my grandfather, whose photo is in the middle of the slide, in 1975, which was the year of the rabbit. And 1975, I was in the United States, I was in year 12, finishing high school there. My father was posted to the US, so, you know, I went along with them and with my parents. And I think we were there for about 3 years, and I didn't particularly want to be there. There were a lot of things about life in the US which I didn't really take to. And I wanted to be back in Japan. I wanted to be back in Japan because my extended family, and particularly my grandparents, and by that stage, my grandmother had passed away, and my grandfather was sort of, to me, a symbol of something that was stable in my life, because we had moved overseas earlier in my life as well. And so my grandfather symbolized for me something to go back to, something stable. And it wasn't that I was particularly close to my grandfather in that kind of interpersonal sense of having lots of, you know, intimate discussions with him. It was just this symbolic thing. And I had a strong image of my grandfather every morning. He'd get up at 7 o'clock and he'd play the shakuhachi, the Japanese flute that you see him playing on this on the photo. And so that was something I heard every morning at 7 o'clock in the morning. And so they were the kinds of things I missed when I was living in the US. And the calligraphy on the right-hand side is a calligraphy that my grandfather had done, which it's a bit difficult to translate, but it says something like sincerity reaches heaven or is eternal, something to that effect. Anyway, so the glass rabbit was something I noticed when I finally went back to Japan in 1976. By that stage, my grandfather was bedridden. He was about to turn 90, and he passed away shortly after I got back to Japan. But the extended family, knowing, you know, that I had a strong association with my grandfather, said that I could keep the rabbit as a, you know, as an object to remember my grandfather by. And so it's traveled with me to Sydney, and it's sitting on top of my fireplace. So I shared this story with my class, and to give them an idea of, you know, what I was talking about when I asked them to bring along an object that had some personal meaning for them. So they were asked to bring a personally meaningful artifact or an image of it to the Zoom class. And I put them into small groups, and they had approximately 5 minutes each to talk to their colleagues about the artifact and its personal meaning to them. And when I was sort of monitoring how the breakout rooms were going, I found that the most silent students were enthusiastically talking about the artifact that they shared. And they were answering questions because the other students were really interested, because the student was talking about the artifact with such enthusiasm. And as an example, I had a student from Saudi Arabia who had until then been very, very quiet. She wouldn't really say a word unless you really, really almost forced her to say something. But she was, you know, chattering away. She was talking about the headdress that Arabic men wear, and, you know, having a lot to say about that, and inviting a lot of questions and interest from her colleagues. So in terms of engaging the students, it seemed to work. And then we debriefed the activity, putting them in the position of a literacy teacher now, and talked about, why it engaged them so much and why it's likely to engage their learners as well. And we observed that, well, this activity gave the students the autonomy to choose, what they would talk about. And students were talking about something that was very familiar to them. And so they were confident about what they were talking about. And they were also interested and passionate about the artifact they chose. And for some of the students, they might not have known the words to describe their artifact in English, but in this instance, they had a reason to learn new words so that they could talk about the artifact that was so important to them. And they were talking about something that, they had a desire to share and to engage their colleagues with. Whereas in some class discussions, maybe the students are saying, well, they're not interested in what I have to say, or I'm not really interested in sharing my views about this topic. But in this instance, they were talking about something that they were passionate about. They were confident to speak about it because they knew about the artifact. So linking, the activity to literacy learning, they started out with an oral presentation, so using the spoken language. And we talked about how this can then lead to literacy lessons focused on, learning to prepare any number of text types about the artifact. So it might be some sort of a descriptive text where they're writing a description of the artifact. In some instances, they brought something that they had made themselves. So it might be some sort of a procedural text, writing the steps of making or producing the artifact. Might be some sort of an information text, writing about the relationship of this artifact to their culture or how it's used. Might be some sort of a narrative text where they're writing a story about the significance of the artifact to them. Or it might be a persuasive text where they're writing about the value or the utility of the ginger grater for somebody going out to the desert and entertaining their friends out there, etc. So it starts out as an oral presentation, but it can lead very naturally to, teaching writing. And, depending on the text type that, your curriculum syllabus says you need to be teaching, you can tailor what they write to that kind of text type. But it can also lead to critical literacies. And this is from an article by some people who are writing about their work with Syrian refugees. And they say that artifacts go beyond increasing understanding and respect to empowering meaning makers into sharing what matters to them with their audience. And with refugee background populations, they open up the classroom space to share not only narratives of their experiences and identities, but also counter narratives that challenge dehumanizing representations of refugees and restore a sense of agency that may have been lost with the violence of displacement. So there are many opportunities for extending this artifactual literacies. And so in summary, artifactual literacies enables the learners to find a safe avenue for engaging and participating in literacy learning, online or offline. And it starts from the use of the spoken language and then moving to the written language. So the mode continuum from the spoken to the written. Has multiple affordances for literacy learning, can lead to critical literacy learning. And it's also another way for us to learn more about our learners, learning about our learners through the artifacts they talk about. And it's a way of building community in the class and for everyone in the class to appreciate each other's cultures and also passions. So this is a bit about artifactual literacies. And now Janet has a proposal.
I do. Yes, I do. Proposal for an artifactual literacy project. Notice how artifact it can spell with an E or with an I, and we've peppered it along the way both. But I kind of like the E. Even though I think in the literature it's usually with an I. But anyway, I'll just give the artifactual a go. So just wanted to say that over the years, Council, New South Wales Adult Literacy and Numeracy Council, have undertaken several projects, and many of you will remember these, with teachers and students, collecting the students' work and publishing it in a print form. And you will remember these wonderful texts that have been produced. And there's some of them right there. Who could forget Red Pocket Rabbit's Foot? Who could forget Home Delivered, Blue Sky Bicycle, Anytime, Any Place? Who could forget Bouquet of Women's Writing? So this is what we've done over the years. We haven't had anything like that for a little while. And times change. And our mode has been exploring online as well. So we've been thinking about, about keeping with their experiences of different, to do something different. And what we're thinking about is an online virtual exhibition of the students' selected artifacts. So they could take a photo of their online thing, accompanied by explanatory text that could be descriptive text or narrative text or procedural text or informational text or persuasive text. So that those texts would go together as in a gallery with the artifact and a text as in a gallery. I myself, I really, if I go to a gallery, I really like to read the texts that go with it. And to me, that's a very, it's a big part of the experience of experiencing the artwork. So especially if the artist has written that text themselves. Yeah, so that's the proposal. And at the end of this session, yeah, so a real exhibition also of the students' artifacts and texts as a second thing. So an online virtual one and possibly a real one with a grand opening in a suitable gallery type venue, such as the Muse at Ultimo. And for students to come and enjoy seeing their work, their artifact or photo of their artifact on display with their text. So this is a proposal as in opening it up to everybody here and to all our teachers to see what you think about this and if you would like to be part of such a project and what other kinds of extensions of this project or directions you might like to suggest. I know that Estelle has got a few suggestions. Yeah, we're opening it up to everybody to ask questions, but also to make comments and make comments what you think about having a project of this kind.
Okay, I'll stop sharing so we can see people.
Thank you, Janet and Keiko. I'm sure everybody's been thinking, aha, I've got a lesson for tomorrow, and everybody's also been thinking of what their artifact is going to be. I've thought of my artifact, but I don't have a class tomorrow to use it with. It almost makes me want to have a class tomorrow.
Oh.
So thank you for sharing those lovely stories. Lovely, lovely. I saw we've got somebody has put a comment in the chat room. 2 people. Can everybody see that, or do I need to read them? Good to hear Keiko's story. That reminds me of my loved parents who passed away. I've got my father's painting. So that person has got their lesson for tomorrow. Any other questions? Does anybody want to put up their hand? You'll have to. What levels of tests are suitable?
Keiko? Yeah, I'm not sure if haven't really thought about tests, but I think this can be done with any group of learners at whatever level of ACSF. You would just want to alter, the type of text that you might get them to produce, or the length of the text, and so forth. I mean, I'm sure you adjust the kind of writing that you get your students to do and the kind of speaking you get your students to do depending on their levels. So I don't think there's any real difference here. And I think if we do have an online exhibition or a face-to-face exhibition, we would welcome contributions from all learners.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that, because I'm thinking of my class. In that class, there were people like from pre-level 1 that were, but it could be extended to people who were even at ACSF, any higher levels, because the text would become more complex but it can be used for people who are just starting out, like really just starting out with assistance in editing, of course. We can be there as, it's also part of the writing process. They have a draft and they edit it, and then they have another draft and maybe conference it with you, and then another, and drafting it and editing it and producing a text that they're proud of and happy with, to go with their. It's good if you get it just right. So it can go through the writing process in producing that text, in editing it. And as a project, it would be, if we're thinking about assessments and things, I always think to mold the assessment around the project that you're doing and the meaningful, interesting thing you're doing, not the other way around, not to sacrifice doing something engaging and interesting. There are ways to do that, to really use something meaningful and interesting. And I think that's what a lot of us in the field want to do. We want to ensure that engagement of students, that excitement about coming to class, about doing literacy, that's maintained and encouraged.
There's a lot of responses there. People are obviously very excited about the thought of putting the students first and designing the curriculum around them. This only has to be a little part of it, doesn't it? But it's a way of engaging them. Look at all those comments. I won't read through all of them, but are there any questions? Yes, there's one question. Do you have any suggestions on how to approach this task with students who are quite private and don't like sharing personal stories? They're often rare, but I've encountered these students and have had trouble navigating it. Keiko or Janet or anybody want to answer that?
I don't think, I mean, maybe it's my fault for talking about, personally meaningful. Maybe you would describe what you want them to bring slightly differently. It might be an object that you find interesting or attached to, or something you've made. I think there are different ways to describe the object that you want them to talk about, so people don't feel that they have to divulge their personal life story in talking about the object, if you think that's going to be a problem for some of the students.
And even I think, like with my graders, I think someone who, and I didn't tell the full story about that, but somebody who didn't want to open up about a personal story could say, I just really like seeing this big grader next to the little grader, and it's very useful and I use it all, just something like that. I think that you can ask them, it doesn't have, maybe you can model something. If you've got people in that class, you could model something that is less of telling us. You could model another situation where you don't actually tell that much of a story, but you just focus on the object. You could do that so that they're not like having to personally divulge things. But I think I was surprised at the time that just about everybody brought something and said something.
And also, I didn't mention it in the slides, but I can't help myself to say that when I saw Janet's grater, the ginger grater next to the, I don't know, carrot grater or whatever it is.
I know what you're going to say.
It can lead to a lesson on artifactual numeracies. And you can even have a photo of the UTS building on the corner of Broadway, the big cheese grater building. So you can have 3 scaled models of a grater. Sorry, I can't help myself.
Does anybody else have any bright ideas that have occurred to them since you've been sitting there thinking? Janet, Estelle, Janet almost dobbed you in and said Estelle's had some ideas.
And then I thought, don't I?
Yes, you do.
I was thinking about the shoebox concept, which I love very much, Janet, that notion of what you brought. I did see in Poland a beautiful exhibition of what people managed to bring with them to Poland when they were fleeing. So it doesn't need to be that personal in terms of the person who just made the comment about personalising too extremely. But what would you take with you if you were going on a desert island, or what would you take? What would your box include? So it could have all the variations of the most extremely emotional to the most unemotional and most practical. And then I thought, if we were to do an exhibition, how wonderful would it be to change those boxes into some sort of diorama, or flip them and decorate them in some way with words and literacy that would be the plinth for the artwork or the object that would then go on top of that. So the shoebox in itself would have multiple uses. That came about just as Janet and I were talking. The other extension that I think in terms of affordances, there's so many things that you mentioned in this workshop that had meaning for me. But in terms of affordances, there's also the greater extension of what we're doing in terms of companionship and camaraderie with our classes and making them feel at one in the context of their class. But there's also research to support by somebody by the name of Gordon Allport. It's called contact theory. It was developed in the 1950s. It's an ongoing sociological concept which talks, and it is known to be the only thing that deals with racism. And I didn't know about it, but I was working on an exhibition and my son came home and said to me, "You do that, Mum. That's what you do when you create an exhibition. It's about engaging everybody, directing everybody and working on a project together where everybody identifies with one another, everybody suddenly understands the other person's position. And so the social dividends of this are much more far-reaching than in this first incarnation. The iteration of it is much, much bigger. But even in its smallest incarnation, it's valuable for every student to feel a place. And on the comment on assessments, there's enough breadth in the source, in the type of assessments that we do, to set up a portfolio where you would discuss the beginning of a plan and a project, where students could discuss and engage their concept, their ideas, their delivery, all the way across to the smallest and the greatest genre of writing. So in terms of assessment, there's room for this without any question. And it can be a very meaningful process, because you would then engage your students in the whole notion of assessment, and they would become part of that process, which I think is also meaningful. It helps them understand what we're looking for. I'm done.
Thank you, Estelle. Thank you for that support.
I sent you as good value, didn't I?
Yep.
I think we need another workshop that is led by Estelle to help us with some of the practicalities of seeing this.
Yeah.
I'll only do it if it's good fun.
Qualified.
Only if it's good fun. Otherwise, I'm not in.
It's always good fun.
But also, what sounds like a lot of fun is that Estelle and I were talking about actually creating artifacts, that being another aspect of what students could actually create their own artifacts with clay or some medium like that, and that we would need a bit of guidance there, Estelle, into how to lead our students there.
There is some really easy to use malleable plastic, which is very similar to clay and not messy for those of us who are very concerned about our TAFE colleges and the tidiness of everything. But if we have time, I'll just share with you one experience that I had, which was really poignant.
Yes, we do have time.
So I was running some art classes as part of our literacy program, and I gave out some of this clay. I've got some here, but I won't get up. And one of our beautiful Indonesian students, who's fairly articulate, she's not too shy, but she made this exquisite, very uncomplicated artwork. It looked like a pod, like a seed pod. So it was hollow, and it could be, and what it was actually was a canoe. And the story that elicited was the fact that she was about 8 years old, between 6 and 8 years old, and her mother went into labour. They were in a remote village or even isolated in Indonesia. And she was very quick thinking and had witnessed a lot of the births in their village or in the area. So she assisted her mother to get into the canoe, and her little brother, who was like 2 years younger than her, so she was 8, he was 6 or less. And she paddled for 2 hours with her mother going into labour.
Wow.
She found a farm, and then her mother started to bleed very heavily. She had witnessed this happening in the village, so she tore her mother's skirt and bound it around her mother's stomach. She knew what to do, and managed to get up to a farmhouse and alert the farmers, because they couldn't reach her father. There's no phone. Her father had gone off into the city or further to do work. The farmer and his wife managed to help them, and somehow alerted the father for when he came home to find nobody home as to what had happened. And then she could have been in big trouble, by the way, for leaving and taking her mother, so she had to act very quickly. The follow-up of the story is that the farmer and his wife didn't have any children and became pseudo-adoptive parents, grandparents to that family and to that little girl that was born, to Tatiana's little sister. So if we hadn't done that little activity, we would never have known that extraordinary story. And there was no way you could elicit that kind, I don't think, that kind of story in a regular classroom. So the thing about clay is that in terms of art material, it's the closest to you. So if you use a pencil, you're already removing your emotion one step away. If you're using clay, it comes of you. And that's what happened, that all of the artifacts were very simple, nothing fancy, nothing complicated, but the stories that came with them were absolutely extraordinary. So that would be the extension of what Janet's proposing, and that's how I see that as its next incarnation. Thank you.
Thank you, Estelle. Anybody else got a comment or a question? Lots of comments saying this is great, and it is great. It's the beginning, I think.
Hand up.
Who was just saying something?
Gary's got his hand up. Gary.
Gary, go ahead.
Sorry, I've been pretty quiet tonight, but I was interested in one of the things in the chat. T-hack, I think it was, the one you started reading, Pam. Do you have any suggestions on how to approach this task? I'm going to lead to an artifact that I have, which I'll show you soon, because I think one or two of you might recognize it. I did this with a group when I was at MTC before I came to TAFE. And I wrote one word on the board, and that word, Keiko, you'll remember this, it was resilience. And I wrote that word on the whiteboard. Some of my students were very introvert. They didn't even know what it meant. So we explored that first of all, and this was the result. It's in my artifact. This is a book that Keiko co-edited, and 9 of my students had their work published in this book.
Oh, that's good.
They wrote very, very personal stories. I mean, I couldn't believe the depth of what they wrote. Now, this is my artifact, it's not theirs, and it's a bit off topic because we're not talking about an artifact here, we're talking about a writing competition. And they opened up in ways that I would never have imagined. And it all started by writing that one word on the whiteboard.
That's lovely.
Yeah, it's one of the best things I've ever done, Keiko. I've said that to you, Pam, before now, when you interviewed me, I think for one of your theses or whatever it was you were doing. I said at that time that it was one of the best things I ever did, and it remains that. It was so touching that they would write so openly about their real touching life experiences. One of them wrote about his experience, he criticized the ESL system in Australia because he'd had such a bad experience as a migrant to Australia. But others wrote about their personal journey through life, and it was really, really touching. And I thought I'd go and grab it and come on camera and speak about that because it meant a lot to me. And it started, as I said, just by writing one word on the whiteboard and prompting discussion and getting them to write. And it was a fabulous experience.
For people who aren't familiar with that project, can you just read the whole title of the book again? Because for people who aren't familiar with it, it's available online, and it's called, Gary?
It's called Resilience, Stories of Adult Learning. And it was co-edited by Keiko and by an English lady, Tara Furlong. So it was an international writing competition.
Lots of lovely
to have 9
stories.
of my students get their work published, only short work, but you know, it was amazing.
This project, I hope, will be another version of that, Gary, in some way. It can be. We've got a link to it on our website, Keiko, or is it just ACAL?
It's on the ACAL website.
The ACAL website. So if anybody wants to access that lovely collection of student stories, it's a link from the ACAL website.
By the way, you won't find my name in there, but you'll find the names of 7 of the 9 students, and 2 of them weren't prepared to put their name to it. They put anonymous.
And I bet they were sorry afterwards.
That's how
they were sorry
all the
afterwards.
stories were.
We're out of time now, so as I was about to say, this is the beginning of another project I can see, and it won't be too difficult to put these stories in a site online, but we're going to depend on people to generate them. So this is just the beginning of our next big project. And can I just say For those of you who maybe aren't yet members of the New South Wales Adult Literacy and Numeracy Council, you might think of joining us to become part of this new project, new journey, or we have lots of other benefits for membership anyway. So that's just a little ad for the night. So thank you again, Keiko and Janet. This has been such an interesting and heartwarming session. Okay.
Thank you, Pam, and thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks Estelle for your stories. I can see that we'll need you to run another workshop with us.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. It was a beautiful session with the participation, with your participation and comments too. So thank you. And I feel something in the air that this project is going to happen.
Yes, I do too.
Mm.